Humans are born with a unique biological deficit. The infant mind arrives without a preloaded sense of self. It lacks the internal architecture to know that it exists. To understand how identity forms, we have to look at the intersection of sociology, neurobiology, and clinical psychoanalysis. Across these fields, researchers consistently trace the origin of self-awareness to a specific physical action, the reciprocal gaze. The capacity to recognize oneself is an acquired epigenetic construct. It must be built over time, and its construction is entirely dependent on continuous external validation from a caregiver. This presents a mechanical problem. How does the infant brain translate raw biological inputs, the physical sensation of touch, and the visual reception of another human staring at them, into a complex, abstract sociological identity? Visual imagery has long been recognized as a central mechanism for shaping perception. By the turn of the 20th century, early cinema explored the psychological weight of the spectator-object relationship, highlighting the intense, unbroken act of looking. Unraveling the mechanics of how looking builds the mind requires mapping three distinct layers of human development: the sociological rules of engagement, the psychoanalytic processing of emotion, and the hardwired neural networks that make it all possible. Psychological autonomy is a biological impossibility in early life. A stable human identity can only be constructed by first passing through the reflection of another's gaze. In 1902, American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley proposed a model for this process. He argued that the human mind is inherently social, meaning a self-concept cannot be generated in isolation. Cooley formalized this into what he called the looking glass self, a three-step cognitive architecture built entirely through social interaction. Step 1 requires the individual to project an image outward. The child imagines how they appear to a significant other, typically the primary caregiver. Step 2 is reception. The child interprets the reaction from that external source. They evaluate social cues, a smile, a nod, or a look of disinterest, as a direct judgment of their projected image. Step 3 is the synthesis. That perceived judgment is internalized as a distinct emotion. If the feedback is positive, the child experiences pride or self-confidence. If negative, shame. The emotion becomes a structural component of their character. Because infants possess no independent frame of reference to evaluate their own worth, this sociological algorithm is strictly mandated. It is the only computational tool they have to lay the first bricks of self-perception. This sociological framework aligns precisely with clinical observation. British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott mapped the same dynamic, noting that the first mirror an individual encounters is not glass, but the mother's face. Winnicott wrote that the precursor of the mirror is the caregiver's face, and that what the baby actually sees in that face depends entirely on the mother's ability to mirror and process the baby's own experience. He defined this interaction as the holding environment. It is the necessary psychological space where the infant's unintegrated, fragmented psyche begins to safely inhabit their physical body. To maintain this environment, the caregiver performs a complex mechanism known as reverie. The infant projects their raw, chaotic emotional states, primitive fears, physical needs, sudden joys, outward toward the caregiver. The caregiver receives these unorganized projections, processes them, and reflects them back through facial expressions and tone as digestible, meaningful human emotions. Reverie in psychoanalysis and reflected appraisal in sociology describe the exact same feedback loop. They are the translation engines converting external emotional regulation into internal social identity. To understand how the infant brain physically wires its synapses to execute this social feedback loop, we have to look at the neurocognitive engine driving the system. The required cognitive engine for self-awareness is joint attention. It is the capacity to coordinate one's own visual focus with that of another person, and researchers have found this skill develops in the human brain as early as 5 months of age. The process develops in stages. It begins with responding to joint attention, an automatic reaction where the infant simply follows another's gaze. It matures into initiating joint attention, a higher-order function where the infant actively uses gestures and eye contact to direct a caregiver's focus. Neuro-developmental researcher Peter Mundy details this mechanism using the parallel distributed processing model. When people interact in joint attention, their brains are engaged in the simultaneous processing of two data streams: information about their own internal attention and visual information about the other person's attention. This parallel processing forces the infant's distributed frontal and parietal cortical systems to continuously map internal somatic data against external social feedback. Mundy's neural model is the literal physical synaptic architecture. It is the biological hardware that the brain builds to execute Cooley's three-step sociological algorithm. This raises a question of motivation. Parallel processing places a massive computational demand on a developing brain. What biological mechanism incentivizes the infant to actively seek out this highly taxing feedback loop? The catalyst is oxytocin. Acting as a biobehavioral synchronizer, this neuropeptide rewards social bonding, modulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis to reduce stress reactivity, and promotes a physical sense of secure attachment. This creates a state of co-regulation. Because the infant cannot manage their own physiological spikes, the caregiver uses their mature, steady neuroendocrine system to act as an external scaffold for the infant's erratic nervous system. This chart shows the physiological reality of the gaze through empirical data. In a study measuring salivary oxytocin in preschoolers, researchers found that children with autism spectrum disorder began with a significantly lower baseline of oxytocin compared to typical development groups. The data revealed a striking physical response to shared attention. After exactly 20 minutes of parent-child interaction involving reciprocal gaze and touch, the oxytocin levels in the ASD group rapidly increased to normative levels, visually demonstrating a chemical normalization. The reciprocal gaze is a measurable physiological regulatory mechanism. It is capable of actively altering endocrine production in real time. We can observe the intersection of these abstract theories in a highly specific everyday domestic behavior, the toddler's repetitive "watch me" loop. When a child jumps off a couch for the 50th time demanding visual attention, they are not seeking superficial praise. They are actively testing the stability of their self-concept using the caregiver's eyes as the metric. With every repetition, the toddler is running Cooley's three-step sociological algorithm, demanding Winnicott's psychoanalytic mirroring and physically reinforcing Mundy's neural pathways. The developmental objective of this loop is internalization. Through thousands of these co-regulatory exchanges, the external validation is slowly transformed into a permanent internal structural boundary. The child learns to self-regulate. The self is an ongoing social process, synthesized through our interactions. We only achieve autonomy by passing through the looking glass of another's gaze.